What if I told you the Pope wasn't always just a spiritual leader, but a king who ruled over a vast European territory with armies, palaces, and political power? And what if I told you it all collapsed on a day known to some as the Black Day of the Vatican? Before we dive into the Vatican's darkest day, we need to take a step back and understand the storm brewing across 19th century Europe. In the 19th century, Europe was a boiling cauldron of revolution. Old empires crumbled, new ideas surged, and in the center stood the Papal States. A religious kingdom ruled not by a monarch, but by the Pope himself. For centuries, the Vatican was a political powerhouse. But winds of change are coming, and they didn't carry incense. The 19th century was a century marked by revolutions, rising nationalism, and the collapse of ancient empires. The Napoleonic Wars had reshaped borders and ideologies, scattering seeds of rebellion and unity in equal measure. The Holy Roman Empire was gone, and with it, the old balance of power began to crumble. Amid this turbulent landscape stood the Papal States, a theocratic kingdom ruled not by a monarch, but by the Pope himself. For centuries, the Pope wasn't just a spiritual leader. He was a political ruler over vast territories in central Italy. But by the 1800s, this medieval concept was looking increasingly out of place in a Europe surging toward modern nation-states. The Enlightenment had challenged divine authority, and secular governance was gaining ground fast. Italy, fragmented into multiple kingdoms and duchies, was a central puzzle piece in this transformation. Movements like the Risorgimento, the Italian Unification movement, were stirring, calling for a united Italy free of foreign and papal interference. Secret societies, intellectuals, and revolutionaries whispered of revolution and unity. The Papal States, rooted in medieval power structures, stood as a glaring obstacle. As European powers grappled for dominance and reform movements gained momentum, the papacy's political control looked increasingly vulnerable. The Vatican may have worn a crown, but it was becoming clear it was made of glass. This is the story of how that glass shattered in what many historians have called the Black Day of the Vatican. The Papal States began as a gift, a territory granted by a king to the Pope, but over time, it grew into a sprawling theocracy. The Pope collected taxes, commanded troops, even negotiated with emperors. It was faith fused with political muscle. But while the Church wore a crown, it also became a target. To truly understand the Vatican's fall, we must first appreciate just how high it once stood. The Papal States weren't just a patch of land. They were the embodiment of spiritual and political dominion in the heart of Europe, originating in the 8th century. The Papal States were granted to the Pope through the donation of Pepin, a gift from the Frankish king Pepin the Short, father of Charlemagne. This act laid the foundation for a theocratic regime where the Pope was both a shepherd of souls and a sovereign ruler. Over the centuries, the Papal States expanded, encompassing a significant portion of central Italy, including cities like Rome, Bologna, and Ravenna. The popes, while viewed as spiritual fathers, also commanded armies, collected taxes, and wielded judicial power. It was a realm unlike any other, where bishops became bureaucrats and monasteries served as government outposts. The Church's influence reached far beyond the altar, shaping diplomacy, trade, and warfare. In many ways, the Papal States acted as a buffer zone between rival European powers, holding geopolitical significance beyond its spiritual value. But this fusion of faith and governance also made the Vatican a target. As the world modernized, the idea of divine right and ecclesiastical governance began to lose favor. Yet for centuries, the papacy clung tightly to its dual identity. The Vatican became an empire of paradoxes, preaching humility while living in grandeur, advocating peace while waging wars to maintain its borders. The system thrived in a Europe of fragmented loyalties and monarchical rule. But as Enlightenment and liberal revolutions took root, the very foundation of the Papal States began to tremble. By the early 19th century, the Vatican's power was already under siege, not from invading armies, but from the shifting ideals of the age. The days of papal kingship were numbered, but the Vatican didn't yet know it. Or worse, it did, and hoped prayer would be enough to stop the tide. By the 1800s, Italy was waking up. The Risorgimento wasn't just a dream, it was a movement. Visionaries and rebels wanted a united Italy, free from foreign rule and papal dominance. The Vatican, once a symbol of Christian unity, now stood as the greatest obstacle to Italian unity. By the mid-19th century, a powerful wind began to blow across Italy. Not a wind of war or invasion, but of ideas. The peninsula, long divided into kingdoms, duchies, and the Papal States, was awakening to a new possibility: unification. The Risorgimento, meaning resurgence, was both a cultural revival and a political revolution. Italians, inspired by Enlightenment thought and national pride, sought to cast off foreign rulers and bring all Italian lands under a single flag. But standing in the very heart of this dream was a deeply rooted obstacle: the Papal States, fiercely guarded by the Vatican and backed by foreign Catholic powers like France and Austria. The Vatican feared unification, seeing it as a threat not just to territory, but to divine authority itself. Meanwhile, revolutionary figures like Giuseppe Mazzini, the ideological soul of Italian unity, and Giuseppe Garibaldi, its military champion, rallied citizens across the peninsula. They believed Italy belonged to its people, not princes, popes, or emperors. Secret societies like the Carbonari spread their message in whispers and pamphlets, while uprisings in cities like Bologna and Rome sent tremors through the Vatican walls. The revolutions of 1848, sweeping across Europe, even forced Pope Pius IX to flee Rome briefly, an unprecedented moment that shocked the Catholic world. Though he returned with the help of French troops, the Pope's aura of invincibility had cracked. Increasingly, the papacy's temporal rule looked like a relic from another era, hopelessly out of step with the march of progress. The Vatican, once a unifying force in Christendom, had become a symbol of division to Italians who dreamed of one nation. Diplomats negotiated, revolutionaries plotted, and soldiers prepared, all while the Vatican prayed. But the tide of nationalism would not be stopped by rosaries or rituals. It was an age where flags replaced thrones, and the thunder of cannon fire began to drown out the solemn chants of the Sistine Chapel. The countdown to the Black Day had begun. As revolution swept the peninsula, the Papal States began to crumble. Piece by piece, city by city, they were absorbed into the new Italy. Even Pope Pius IX, once hailed as liberal, became a fortress of resistance. But the clock was ticking. Rome was surrounded, politically, militarily, and ideologically. The walls of the Papal States didn't crumble overnight. It was a slow, grinding erosion marked by defeats, betrayals, and desperate political maneuvering. Throughout the mid-19th century, Pope Pius IX found himself walking a tightrope, trying to uphold ancient authority while navigating a world that no longer believed in divine rule over political matters. After the failed 1848 revolutions, the Pope had returned to Rome with the help of French forces, but his grip on power had been irrevocably weakened. In truth, the Papal States had become a puppet propped up by foreign bayonets, particularly those of Napoleon III's France. Every year that passed saw more revolts, more pressure, and more discontent from the Italian people. Meanwhile, the Kingdom of Sardinia, led by the ambitious Count Camillo di Cavour, was skillfully negotiating and fighting to unify the Italian territories under King Victor Emmanuel II. With every annexation, from Lombardy to Tuscany, the Papal States became increasingly isolated, a shrinking island in a rising nationalist sea. Then came the death blow, the Second War of Italian Independence in 1859, where Sardinia allied with France to defeat Austrian forces and begin reshaping Italy's northern half. Soon after, Garibaldi's legendary expedition in 1860, the Expedition of the Thousand, stormed through Sicily and southern Italy, liberating and uniting territory after territory. As Garibaldi marched north, the Papal States looked increasingly like a prize waiting to be claimed. In a desperate act to preserve papal rule, Pope Pius IX declared Rome a sacred city, urging Catholics across the world to defend it. Thousands of volunteers known as the Zouaves, many from France and Belgium, answered the call. But their numbers and zeal could not match the modern, organized armies now moving against them. By 1860, most of the Papal States had been annexed, leaving the Pope in control of little more than Rome and its immediate surroundings. The loss wasn't just territorial, it was symbolic. The Vatican's centuries-old dominion was being erased by a new vision of Italy. Diplomatically cornered, militarily outmatched, and politically outdated, the Papal States were in freefall. And though Rome was still under papal control, its fate was sealed. The storm was gathering. The final act, the Black Day of the Vatican, was just around the corner. On the morning of September 20th, 1870, as dawn broke over the Eternal City, the bells of Rome did not ring in celebration, but in alarm. Thousands of Italian troops, under the command of General Raphael Cadorna, surrounded the city, poised to deliver the final blow to papal sovereignty. The last remnants of the Papal States, reduced to the city of Rome and a few surrounding towns, stood as a fragile bubble of divine authority in a nation that had already chosen unity over theocracy. Pope Pius IX, still hoping for a miracle or foreign intervention, refused to surrender without a symbolic fight. Within the city, the papal zouaves, a patchwork of foreign volunteers loyal to the Pope, manned the ancient walls, preparing to face an army they had little chance of defeating. At 5:10 a.m., the first cannon shot rang out, and the siege began. Over 4,000 shells were fired at the city that day, many of them striking the Porta Pia, one of Rome's historic gates. By 10 a.m., a breach had been made. Italian forces poured into the city, overwhelming the vastly outnumbered defenders. The Pope, recognizing the futility of bloodshed, ordered his men to lower their weapons at 10:35 a.m., just 25 minutes after the breach. The tricolor flag of the newly unified Kingdom of Italy replaced the papal banners, and with it, over 1,000 years of papal rule came to a dramatic end. It wasn't just a military defeat, it was a symbolic decapitation of the Vatican's temporal power. For Pope Pius IX, it was nothing short of humiliation. He retreated into the Apostolic Palace, declaring himself a prisoner in the Vatican, a protest against the loss of his lands and influence. In defiance, he refused to recognize the legitimacy of the Kingdom of Italy and forbade Catholics from participating in Italian politics, a stance known as a non-expedit policy. The papacy, once a geopolitical titan, had been reduced to a spiritual enclave within a secular nation. This moment, now known by some historians and church traditionalists as the Black Day of the Vatican, marked the dramatic collapse of a 1,000-year-old theocratic empire. Streets once marched by crusaders and cardinals now echoed with the footsteps of Italian soldiers. The keys of St. Peter no longer opened kingdoms. They merely unlocked doors in the Vatican Palace. The fall of Rome in 1870 didn't just redraw maps. It redefined the Catholic Church itself, forcing it to confront a future without land, armies, or political dominion. The curtain had fallen, and a new act in church history was about to begin. In the immediate aftermath of Rome's capture, the Vatican entered a period of silence and standoff, locked in a standoff with the Italian state. Pope Pius IX, bitter and unyielding, refused to leave the Vatican, casting himself as a symbol of a church betrayed by the world. For nearly 60 years, successive popes would maintain this prisoner of the Vatican stance, refusing to recognize Italy's legitimacy or the loss of the Papal States. This self-imposed isolation, however, was not a death sentence. It was the beginning of a profound transformation. Deprived of territory and political clout, the Catholic Church began to refocus its energy inward, consolidating spiritual authority and strengthening global influence. The fall of temporal power paradoxically gave rise to a stronger, more unified spiritual empire. Missionary work expanded. The Pope's voice, once entangled in European politics, now carried a moral authority that transcended borders. The Vatican became a beacon of global Catholicism, its leader no longer a monarch among kings, but a shepherd among nations. This transition was formalized in 1929, when Pope Pius XI and Benito Mussolini signed the Lateran Treaty, officially recognizing the Vatican city-state as an independent, sovereign entity. The papacy regained a small territory, just 44 hectares, but it was enough to preserve its independence. In return, the Church finally recognized the Kingdom of Italy, ending the decades-long impasse. Ironically, the loss of the Papal States freed the Vatican from the burden of governance. Without armies or taxation, the Pope's role became purely pastoral. He was no longer seen as a medieval relic, but a global religious figure. The Vatican began using modern tools, radio, diplomacy, and global networks, to project its message. Popes began traveling, addressing global crises, and even shaping world opinion on issues of war, poverty, and peace. The Black Day of the Vatican was, at its heart, a death and a rebirth. It marked the end of a powerful, land-owning church state, but also heralded the emergence of a more focused and spiritually potent Vatican. Today, when people visit Rome, they see the majestic dome of St. Peter's Basilica not as a throne of kings, but as a lighthouse of faith. The legacy of that fateful day in 1870 is a reminder that institutions must adapt or perish, and that sometimes, in losing the world, one may gain the soul.